a very short time ago, a paper was published in the British Medical Journal that created a lot of controversy about saturated fats, with the headline that saturated fat's role in heart disease is a myth. And this was an article written by a cardiologist. As you can imagine, it was very, very controversial. There were arguments back and forth. And fascinatingly, in the same issue of the British Medical Journal, there was an article about palm oil, which is a classic saturated fat. And in this paper, the researchers claimed that if palm oil was decreased in consumption in India, where it forms a large part of the diet, it would have a very, very significant impact on heart disease. Well, that, of course, is just a theoretical meandering, because, as I just explained earlier, there isn't all that hard evidence that saturated fat is implicated in heart disease, as this paper would imply. In fact, we can even look at another paper which draws this rather fascinating graph about saturated fat intake and heart disease. And the more saturated fat, the less heart disease. Now, of course, you have to be very, very careful about looking at data such as this, because in the countries here where there's a less saturated fat intake and greater incidence of heart disease, there are many, many other differences. If you look at Georgia and Moldavia, and etc., I mean, they have a diet that is very different from our diet. They may have different exercise habits. I mean, many variables. I mean, the only reason to even mention this is to show that the evidence is not all that conclusive. And then, of course, we have the French paradox, where you take a look at 50 million Frenchmen who eat all of those croissants and high-fat cheeses and stuff their geese and eat their fatty livers and have high cholesterol levels, higher than us, and yet have a lower incidence of heart disease. So what's going on there? Well, the usual explanation to the French paradox is the red wine, and that an ingredient in red wine called resveratrol reduces their risk of heart disease. Well, that is also contentious. And it's very contentious whether or not there is such a thing as the French paradox in the first place, because it seems that death certificates are not filled out the same way in France as they are filled out in North America. And there are many so-called sudden deaths which are never ascribed to heart disease. So it's hard to know. So the saturated fats may not be quite as guilty as we've been led to believe, but the notion always is to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats. And here's one study that shows that that may be the way to go. Consuming polyunsaturated in place of saturated fats, in this case, reduce the incidence of heart disease. So you can find a study to back up almost any view that you want. Of course, the question here is it the reduction of the saturated fat that is important, or is it the fact that polyunsaturates have some sort of health benefit? And that may be a possibility too, because there are some polyunsaturates that will reduce inflammation. And we've already talked about the problems with inflammation. However, before we get too confident in replacing the saturated fats with the polyunsaturated fats, we'll look at the Sydney study, which was just recently published. And in this case, they looked at linoleic acid, which is a classic polyunsaturated fat. It's the kind of fat that is found in corn oil, safflower, sunflower oil, etc. And look what they came up with in this study, is that the more of this particular polyunsaturated fat was consumed, the greater the risk for heart disease. And they even have an explanation for it, and that is that linoleic acid can stimulate inflammation. And we've seen the negative aspects of inflammation. So it's not so straightforward to suggest that just replacing any saturated fat with any polyunsaturated is a good thing. It depends on which saturated fat and which polyunsaturated, and of course things get more and more complicated. I think that there's pretty good agreement that if you're going to go the poly route, omega-3 fats are the ones that we should be looking at, because they are anti-inflammatory. And one of the problems with our nutrition may be that in recent years we have been taking in too many omega-6 polyunsaturated fats and not enough omega-3s. So maybe what we should be looking at is the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. So again, we have this complication. It's not only a question of saturated fat, depends which saturated fat, because they don't all behave in the same way. It's not only a question of which poly, they don't all behave the same way. It's not replacing one by the other. There are all kinds of variables. And in this case, if we're going to replace some saturated fats with some polys, well, we should take a look at which poly. And the ones that have a better ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, like fish or like flaxseed oil, those are the ones that we should be looking at. And I think there's pretty good agreement that eating fish is a good thing to do because of the omega-3 fat content that we have there. So omega-3s are kind of basking in the limelight, you know, and omega-6s are, you know, being attacked for being pro-inflammatory. And people are trying to get more omega-3s into their diet, including in omega-3 eggs. Now, in this particular case, the omega-3 fat is not the same as what we find in fish. It's a closely related one called alpha-linolenic acid, which in the body is converted to the, in a small proportion though, to the fish oil, or the docosahexaenoic acid and icosapentaenoic acid. But this is really not significant, the amount of omega-3 we would get from those eggs. But as I said, also there's no real reason to worry about eating eggs, unless of course you're going to eat 25 a day. But as we saw, there's even a case where that didn't make a difference. So the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is important. And flaxseed, for example, is one that has a very good ratio because it has a lot of omega-3 relative to omega-6. Walnut oils is also another one, although that one tends to be pretty expensive. But that's a good one to use on salads, and canola is a good one to be cooking with.